Thank you so much, Priscilla, for that kind introduction. I would like to begin by actually asking all of us to reflect for a moment of silence out of respect and in honor of the lives that were lost yesterday in Uvalde. Thank you all. My name is Sewell Chan. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune, and I'm very happy to be here in San Antonio. In fact, the Texas Tribune now has 4 employees in San Antonio, the highest ever. We have a video journalist, an education reporter, a political correspondent, and a data analyst based right here in the Alamo City. And we're very, very proud to be here in San Antonio and to be part of this community. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you for joining our one-on-one conversation with San Antonio Mayor Ron Nirenberg, whom I had the great pleasure of meeting on Saturday at the San Antonio Book Festival. Give a hand to the mayor. I want to thank our sponsors for making this event possible. Thank you to City Health, the Texas Municipal League, CPS Energy, Raise Your Hand Texas, and Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas. Thank you as well to our media partners for this event, KSAT and San Antonio Report, and to the folks at Alamo College's district for hosting us here today. Ron Nirenberg was first elected mayor of San Antonio in 2017. He's the former chair of Sister Cities International, a nonprofit organization that connects cities across the globe. Previously, Nirenberg served 2 terms on the San Antonio City Council, founded 2 small businesses, managed a San Antonio radio station, and was a program director for the Annenberg Public Policy Center. Let's get started. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Sorry to start on such a hard topic, but please tell me when and where, how did you find out about the shooting in Uvalde yesterday?
Well, yesterday at work, we were actually in a lunch with Janet Munguia of Unidos US, but like everyone else, it just came across as an alert, and at that point, we were all scrambling for information, for facts about what occurred. And the initial moments of that, obviously, there were just a scattering of facts that were coming across. It wasn't until the governor's press conference that we knew the magnitude of what we were facing.
Was San Antonio able to deploy any help or resources?
Yeah, well, we have cooperative arrangements with the communities in the surrounding area. San Antonio, obviously, the hub of much of our disaster and emergency response regionally. So very quickly, in terms of the emergency response, our police department, fire department, EMS were all on scene. We sent an Eagle, the helicopter, as well as our bomb squad to assist. And then, of course, it moved to crime scene investigation that is all in assisting the Texas Rangers, who are the lead agency in the crime investigation.
You have a young son. How did you explain this to him?
Well, I don't think I did. You know, my son Jonah is now of the age where, unfortunately, he's seen so many of these take place. I remember in 2012, he was 7 when Sandy Hook happened, and trying to explain that to a child is beyond what you're prepared to do as a parent. And it's really beyond comprehension in terms of trying to make sense of it. So it's really, you know, for my son, at least at his age, it's really just telling him the facts of what occurred. And you know, unfortunately, we've been through this once again, and you know, it's a sad day in America. It's a sad day in every parent's household, and it certainly is here in South Texas as well.
What message would you like lawmakers in Austin and Washington to take away from this, from the perspective of cities?
You know, first, I think it's extremely important for us to recognize that there is a significant and collective trauma that's being experienced in our communities. certainly in Uvalde where families are grieving, and our focus needs to be on wrapping our arms around them and making sure that we can help them in any way that's necessary, and our entire community is stepping up for that. But in the days that unfold, there'll be a lot to unpack, and I think as it relates to our legislators at the federal and state level, yesterday was an election day. And as I mentioned before, the feeling deep down inside, which is extremely unfortunate and unnecessary, is that we know deep down inside we're going to be back here again, and it's not necessary. I've stood with Moms Demand Action. I've stood with Everytown, with Mayors Against Illegal Guns. The reality is, here at the local level in the state of Texas, they have largely tied our hands with regard to making any sort of change, and have put that responsibility on themselves. And in the last 10, 15 years, as we've endured mass shooting after mass shooting, and children dying in schools in multiple cities, and targeted violence, it would be one thing if we could say, let's try to make it better in Texas. At the very least, don't make it worse. And state leadership in this city, in this state, have been hell-bent on making it worse. And at some point, I and every other voter in the state of Texas needs to demand an answer, and needs to hear their answers to how they're going to end the scourge of violence that's happening all across the state and across our country.
Texas has had at least 8 mass shootings now since 2013, and of course this isn't even the first one at a school. We can go back as far as the UT Tower shooting in the 60s, but also more recently the Santa Fe High School shooting. What explains why we seem locked in this kind of very futile kind of repeat cycle that has left many of us feeling pretty numb?
Well, the numbness, I think, is directly from that trauma that we're experiencing, and the fact that we're used to being here. And on the part of members of our community that are immediately have that feel, well, what can I do? And that's why I appreciate what Priscilla was mentioning about, folks are donating blood. We have incredible nonprofits who are already on the ground there providing grief counseling. Everyone is going through their stages and processing of this, specifically those family members in the community, a very small community that stands around them. But, can you repeat your question again? I'm sorry.
Well, why does it politically feel so hopeless?
Well, because the folks that we continue to hold responsible for having the courage to act don't exhibit the courage to act.
Why is that?
I think that we know how strong the gun lobby is. We know how difficult it is to have logical conversations about things like background checks and red flag laws, which we had been talking about for years. Common sense, the gun legislation immediately goes towards an attack on the Second Amendment writ large. And until we can have a reasonable conversation with people on both sides of the aisle about things that can just end the scourge of violence, we're going to be locked in this cycle.
What do you say to those, last question on this, what do you say to those who argue that the solution is that you need more teachers who are armed, more school security officers who are armed, the school marshal program?
If more guns in our community made us a safer community, the United States would have been the safest community in the world a long time ago.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I wanted to talk with you, begin a little bit by talking about kind of, the emergence from COVID. COVID was, of course, a transformative event for this city and for your administration. You got a lot of attention early on for appearing regularly with Bexar County Judge Nelson Wolff. In fact, he recently wrote a book for which you are on the introduction. He couldn't be there on Saturday because he came down with COVID himself. But tell us a little bit about what you learned from that experience and how this city can be better prepared for the next pandemic.
Well, I think we're still learning from the pandemic. That's quite evident. There's a lot that I personally learned, and I think that our communities are learning. First of all, here in San Antonio, I think what we learned is that our bread and butter, the foundation of success in our city, is collaboration. We have the highest social vulnerability index in the state of Texas, meaning that it's we have communities that are high in poverty, that have poor health outcomes, that have lower access to public services and transportation and access to health care. And all that is a very combustible mix when you enter into a period where there's an epidemic, a new virus, and that's creating challenges in our community. We work together to address those, and I think because of that, we have fared well relative to some of our peers around the state and around the country. And in fact, I like to point out, as I did on Saturday, that San Antonio has the highest vaccination rate among the metros in Texas. That happens because we are working together. I think the most important lesson, though, that we've learned collectively is something that, frankly, I ran on as mayor in 2017, that we have a very broken and inequitable economic foundation in this country and in this city that manifests itself in disparate health outcomes and high poverty and lack of access to education and economic mobility. And I mentioned this, that the image of the pandemic when it first began were those lines of cars at the food bank. The aerial photo, everybody can see it in their mind because they've seen that photo across the world. 120,000 families in San Antonio, in the San Antonio area, literally the moments that the pandemic began, required assistance from the food bank to keep food on the table. That was double what was experienced just before the pandemic began, when we had 3% unemployment, we had billion-dollar investments coming in from corporations. We had the best economic momentum we've had in a lifetime. We still had 60,000 families a week who were needing assistance from the food bank just to feed their children. That was the state of San Antonio, but that was also not unique to San Antonio. That was the state of our country. Millions of American families who are one event away from economic catastrophe, on the brink. And overnight, that event became the pandemic. That event was the pandemic. And so we saw that, and that has led to this push to build equity in our communities, to ensure that we have, we're building resilience. The president's Build Back Better agenda can be seen through that lens of trying to build resilience in the community so we're stronger than when we were before the pandemic. Because again, we were building this great city, this great country on a broken economic foundation that reared its head when that event happened. And so, for us here in San Antonio, that is affirmation of what we've been trying to do, which is break cycles of generational poverty, which is to make sure that communities that have been disinvested in have their fair share of proper infrastructure, whether that's just a sidewalk to school or a drainage culvert to make sure that their homes don't get flooded out when it rains. So we've been working on that since 2017, and credit to my colleagues who have been committed to equity, committed to the principles of equity through all the things that we do at the city. If we can stay on that, commit to that as a country, we will build resilience. And to me, that's what we learned, is that should have been the focus, that needs to be the focus, and thankfully, with partners at the federal level, it is the focus now. And we are resourcing and scaling up those areas that is helping San Antonio, number one, but also cities around this country.
And yet the child tax credit, which had been extended, has been allowed to expire.
Right.
There is still a lot of debate over what to do over the student loan program, and additional stimulus has been blocked by the Congress. How can cities cope without more of this federal aid?
That's a great question, and that's the challenge, is that we have to do this through a political system, and there will be debates. I will tell you that one of the things I'm most proud of the city of San Antonio is that we work together. This is a confluence of cultures. We're a military city. We have people from all over the world. We have 14% foreign-born population here in San Antonio. And so this is a community that has different beliefs politically. We're almost right down the middle. We have different cultures and backgrounds. We have different expectations and dreams for our lives and for our children, but somehow we work together. And, you know, and through the city council, you can see that lens. We're a pretty dynamic politically group, but we have been committed to the process of budgeting with an equity lens for the last 5 years, despite, you know, the council seats changing almost entirely. You know, I have my council colleagues on the north side who, you know, that's a more property wealthy area where there's, you know, infrastructure is hardened because it's built on limestone. Making sure that we're not just demanding 1/10 of our 10-district pie, but we're making sure that we're budgeting as a whole city, as a whole organism, and we're sending the resources down to the east side and the west side and the south side where they're needed. A little bit more. They need extra in order to catch up. And this isn't a process that's going to take place overnight. We're committed to it till we get it done, which is going to outlast many of our lifetimes.
Mr. Mayor, two plus years ago, you came in before the pandemic. You had big plans to advocate for a sales tax funded transit program. How did you make the shift and pivot from focusing on physical infrastructure to human?
Yeah, that's a great question. It didn't happen easily, but I will say, so number one, the sales tax was already being assessed, so we weren't asking for additional sales tax. And I also want to mention that despite sort of the pivot that we had to make, we've actually advanced that advanced rapid transit system and public transportation as a priority almost to the point and maybe beyond where we thought we would be if the pandemic didn't happen. So as an aside, but how did we make that pivot? Why did we make that pivot? It goes back to the last thing we were talking about. When the reality of what we were facing hit us in the face, and the old saying goes, everybody has a plan until they're punched in the face, that's what happened with this pandemic. We saw in full detail the crisis that families were in. And so the judge and I sat down and said, we're tossing out all of our priorities, we're breaking down the bureaucracy, and we're going to pool our resources and our authorities together, and we're going to operate like one unit. And so we decided to put together council and commissioner court committees that would focus on the basics that people needed to be able to survive this pandemic and for us to be able to emerge from it. Housing and food security, workforce, digital inclusion, small business, and of course the health aspects of what we were facing. So we changed our priorities because that's what the moment demanded.
How do you make progress when you have a state government that is telling you no mask mandates, a state government that is even intervening in your downtown redevelopment project? Tell us a little bit about the federalism relationship right now in Texas between the capital and the cities.
Yeah, I'm trying to make sense of that too. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You know, and I've got a lot we can say about many different specific items that you mentioned. But how do we make progress? All politics is local. I am blessed beyond belief to be a resident of this fine city because, you know, when we look out for each other, San Antonians rally around each other. We're a compassionate people, and while we disagree on occasion, when there is an issue that we have to tackle together, we do it together. And so with regard to the mask mandates, we tried to find some ways around the governor's orders, which themselves were changing, and we found a few, and we got some things done. We challenged the fact that he was using his emergency authority to declare emergency and then prevent us from mitigating that emergency. And then, you know, we also were able to find that the health code that we applied to businesses was a way to also include mask mandates in a health code. So we were able to work around that. But at the end of the day, when a state seems to be at war with its cities are going to rely on their populations and their ability to convene as leaders a common cause, a common purpose. And here in San Antonio, our common purpose was to care for each other and to make sure that we could get through this pandemic together. And so even though we didn't have a mandate, when the judge and I went on and said, transmission is very high, you should wear a mask indoors, by and large, people started wearing masks indoors. They didn't have to be forced to. We appealed to their sensibility and their care for their neighbors to be able to do that.
So, 2/3 of Texas now lives in the so-called Texas Triangle, and 80% plus of Texans live in urban areas. Where do you see the dynamic playing out between Austin and the cities over time?
On the 35 corridor, I think that it is inevitable, it's already happening, that this is becoming a metroplex. And we are, as that happens naturally, economically, politically, what we are going to do, we should be doing, is looking at ourselves as an entity, as a metroplex, as one community, with strengths that reside in different quarters. San Antonio has an incredible medical community. San Antonio has a military community. San Antonio has an advanced manufacturing community. Austin has a tech community. Austin has some wonderful event venues. What we need to do is be working together to tie our communities together, both in terms of as a coordinated community where we can identify with each other, but also in transportation, allowing for commerce, allowing for movement of people so that we can begin to draw from each other's strengths. I think that's going to happen naturally, but I think it behooves us to begin to have more conversations that move us in that direction.
Now, it seems to me there are just as many San Antonians who would like nothing to do with Austin in terms of the skyrocketing housing prices,
Sure.
maybe some other dimensions as well. How do you, San Antonio is, of course, trying to capture some of the wealth that's coming Texas's way, right? If we're thinking about all the corporations and
Sure.
the tech companies and the innovation that's landed here. But of course, you have to balance that with sustainability and affordability.
Right.
And how do you feel your residents want to seek that balance?
Well, we want to make sure that we still make the tacos, because we do it well, we do it better. But no, seriously, I think how do we make sure that we are the best versions of ourselves, but we also have a community identity. I love San Antonio because it's an authentic city. And there is nothing that's going to break us away from our binational identity with Mexico. And that is part of the reason why people enjoy the city. They come down to experience, the northernmost city in Mexico, as I refer to it. And, why do people go to Austin? Austin's, weird. It's dominated by the University of Texas at Austin. I hope it never loses that.
And you grew up in Austin, so you know.
I do. I went to high school there, and then I came down to San Antonio as fast as I could. And San Antonio is a great place to raise a family. So, I think we have to continue to enhance our strengths and not be afraid to work with each other, to draw from each other. You mentioned the housing market in Austin, and it's really crazy what's happening with housing prices. I have family there. And one of the things that we can do is learn from that, because Austin's cycle of economic development is not in many ways different from what other cities are experiencing, and that what other cities will experience. So we have to learn from each other as well. And that's one of the things that I'm excited about, collaboration along the 35 corridor.
Staying on economic issues, how do you feel that the debates over work, and in particular remote work, hybrid work, what impact will that have on a place like San Antonio? Is it making it easier to kind of retain or even re-attract, people who might have moved to larger cities?
Yeah.
Does it affect downtown redevelopment because you're going to have office buildings with less vacancy? Net, how do you see that playing out?
I think the verdict is still out on that, but I do think that San Antonio is in a unique position to be enhanced by the trends that are happening. And I also say that San Antonio is investing in the areas addressing challenges within the economic system across the country proactively in a way that I think cities are beginning to fall in the same line. But San Antonio is doing it bigger, and we're doing it faster, I think, in many ways. So I think because of those investments, San Antonio is in a unique position to benefit from the emergence from the pandemic. Certainly, in terms of housing and quality of life, we're making strategic investments. We had our first ever affordable housing bond that was passed by 60% of the voters just a couple of weeks ago. We are doing and using every tool in our toolbox to make sure that we can continue to have a quality, sustainable, affordable housing market in this community, at the same time enhancing our quality of life. You know, the San Antonio Riverwalk is not like you have ever experienced it before if you haven't been here in 5 years. We're going to be finishing up the San Pedro Creek project. You've got a old theater that's finally fully funded that's going to be the capstone of a river project. We have the UTSA downtown, which is a national security collaboration center, and vibrant student nightlife. We're a city of gastronomy. There's so many reasons why people are moving here to enjoy the city, but also to enjoy a quality of life if they're part of the workforce. Now, the question is, will they be able to find a job here? And that's the part where I'm most excited. We're making investments in workforce to ensure that we are growing the jobs that are in demand and that folks have an opportunity to gain from that.
San Antonio is not home to that many not home to many of the nation's largest corporations,
right,
despite being one of the nation's largest cities. Does that need to change?
I don't know. So it will change. I think it is changing, and you know, from my perspective, the hardest part of economic development in San Antonio is getting folks to book the first flight, because once they get down here and experience the city, they're hooked. They fall in love with it. When they see what we're doing proactively on workforce, which is the weakness in every urban community in the country, making sure we have talent and skilled labor to fuel the jobs of tomorrow, when they see what we're doing on that proactively, they will see that this is a city where they can have probably one of the best long-term investments in the country. But you know, I think that in terms of it happening, it's happening already. We have a $2.5 billion redevelopment plan for the San Antonio International Airport, which will very soon be able to fly at any corner of the world from San Antonio, which is in the heart of our city. And so there's a lot of things that we're doing now that's creating momentum that is going to be realized in many ways by some of those companies choosing San Antonio. The hardest part right now is to get folks to understand our story and view it and see it. You asked, though, does it need to happen? You know, this is one of the beauties of San Antonio. This is a wonderful place to live. There's a natural evolution here. Are we trying to force the matter? Absolutely not. When people see and feel and experience San Antonio and what we're doing here, they get hooked and they invest. But San Antonio is an authentic city. We love who we are. We're not going to give that up. We're going to become the best version of ourselves, but we're not going to give up our identity in the process.
Was it a mistake not to build kind of a joint airport halfway between San Antonio and Austin, which was once contemplated?
It depends on when you ask that question. You know, there is a strategic competitive advantage to being the 7th most populous city in the United States that is growing in the way that it is, with a focus on equity and inclusive prosperity, that also happens to have an international airport in the heart of the city, which is basically 15 minutes away from any visitor or business destination you would want to go to. So my question in informing a committee to grow the airport and expand connectivity was, would our airport of the future that is connected to every continent and it has high connectivity and is built for what will be population-wise perhaps the 3rd largest city in the country in 30 years from now, does our footprint and does the airport where it stands, is that adequate? Can it be built there? Will it fit? And if the answer is yes, then we can build on the strategic competitive advantage right here in our city without having to go somewhere else. And the answer, after technical business and aviation experts got down and looked through all of the data is, yes, it will fit. So that's why we're embarking on this airport expansion plan. And we're also getting more connectivity, is that we're trying to skate to where the puck is, or we're trying to skate to where the puck is going. And it is going in a direction where we're going to need that connectivity, and we're going to also need competitive advantages, and SAT is that as we grow it and realize that strategic plan.
Now, there is one form of transportation and mobility that you've been less enthusiastic about, and that includes a proposal advanced by Elon Musk. Could you talk a little bit about your correspondence with him?
Well, I haven't corresponded with Elon. That tends to get folks in trouble these days. But no, I was asked the question, what do I think of the boring tunnel, which you're referring to? And clearly we have a lot of priorities here in San Antonio and across Texas with regard to transportation. Public transportation is a big void, with respect to where we need to be, and that's why we're growing our metropolitan transit system and we're introducing ART finally. But when I look at the proposal, it doesn't address any of those issues, and in fact, introduces a whole new set of questions that start with the revenue model, and also go to the fact that we have a lot of roads. Our issue isn't necessarily more roads; it's how we move people. And so, if we're just building another road underground, how is that any different than just adding more capacity to the highway? So, especially if it's tolled and you can only drive Teslas in it. So there's a lot of questions that are introduced by that proposal that don't address questions that I have about our transportation system.
Now, the transit system plans have had to be delayed a bit because of COVID, right?
Right.
What's the new timetable?
Well, as I mentioned before, our focus was Connect SA, which was a comprehensive view of our transportation, all working together as one unit, from our micromobility and first mile, last mile, to our linear creekway trails system, to our via metropolitan public transportation system, to our highways and to our city streets and pedestrian access. All that's still moving forward. In fact, we just made a $103 million new investment in our linear creekway trails, which are now a mobility system through our bond program that passed just a couple of weeks ago. Via Metropolitan Transit, which is the significant area of focus, now has the first ART line north-south fully funded. It's on the president's budget. We have already passed in November 2020 a sales tax initiative that kicks in 2026 to start funding operationally new lines for public transportation. That was the big hangup. And so when I look at what VIA is and where the timetable is, we're well on our way. And I think the estimate in terms of the ART, and I don't know if there's anybody from VIA here, but I think it's late 2020s that we will start being able to utilize the ART system north-south. Now our work is to accelerate east-west so we can have a bona fide system of ART in San Antonio.
Fantastic. Now, no conversation in San Antonio, it seems, can be complete without some discussion of the Alamo. Can you tell us a little bit about the state of the redevelopment plan? There's a broad perception that it has gotten stalled, and there's also a perception that perhaps there's been an opportunity lost to broaden the narrative of the Alamo for the many people who experience it each year.
I don't think it's stalled. It was stalled. In fact, it was on the brink of being ended. And then, I made some changes to the committees, and we got back together. And from my view, it has been moving forward. Mind you, this is a project that has been 40 years in the making through different development committees. But the focus is twofold. One is the actual development, the buildings and the footprint of the Alamo, and bringing some historic realism back to the site and recapturing the footprint. That is taking place. The shoring up the buildings and making sure that they're preserved properly is also happening. Now, with regard to the narrative, this is the most difficult aspect of it all, because we know factually what has taken place at the Alamo. It is a story not just of the Battle of 1836, but it's a story of indigenous peoples in San Antonio. It's a story of slavery in San Antonio. It's a story of civil rights in San Antonio. It's even a story of modern-day public use of a square that has been the site of, most recently, protests during the George Floyd aftermath. So it is a living, breathing part of our public square. And my perspective, we have to be true to the facts. Because over time, as we've seen in many different arenas, depending on who it is, the interpretation of the facts are going to be a little different. Let's put all of the facts out there and let people judge for themselves. And let's be accurate. Let's focus on accuracy. The other part of this is let's also make sure that we're being reverent, because it is also a cemetery. It is a place where defenders of the Alamo laid down their lives for defense of independence of Texas. It also is a place where we continue to memorialize what's taken place in San Antonio. So we have to be respectful. The other challenging part of that, though, is that it's part of our public square. As I mentioned, it's a living, breathing part of San Antonio, and it has to remain that as well. So I think the committee has a massive task on their hands, but they're handling it quite well, all things considered. My hope is that we will continue to work together. It's a tri-party, so it's a very fragile relationship, state, city, as well as the trust. And we're working together, and we have a vision to make sure that we do right by what is the most important piece of real estate in the state of Texas.
So on the state end of that, Land Commissioner George P. Bush, who got in quite a bit of hot water just for entertaining the idea of moving the cenotaph, of course, last night he lost his bid for the Republican nomination for Attorney General. What has Commissioner Bush's legacy been on the Alamo project? And just as importantly, what do you hope his successor, which will be either Don Buckingham or Jay Kleberg, what do you want from them?
You know, my relationship with Commissioner Bush on this project has been a good one. I think he's managed to balance a lot of the challenges that he experiences politically on his side of the aisle, and has been focused on making sure that we are taking advantage of a moment in time where there are resources and people willing to ensure the longevity of the Alamo, both the stories as well as the development, and in a respectful way, not just to all the history of the Alamo, but also the future of the Alamo, which is, again, in the center of the city of San Antonio. It's been a delicate partnership for all of us, and there's been moments where we thought it was going to fall off the cliff, like back in March of, I think it was 2020. But we've gotten it back on track, and he has been a helpful steward in that. My hope for his successor is that we will stay on that vision. It's not going to be easy. Every person in Texas feels like they own a part of the Alamo, and we have to be mindful of that and proceed, again, with an eye towards the future, that we're going to be accurate, that we're going to be respectful, that we're going to leave the facts out for themselves, and that we're also going to ensure that it remains a vibrant part of the San Antonio life.
Mr. Mayor, a couple questions on your personal plans. You've announced an intention to run for a fourth and, I believe, final term next year. That's right. Is that correct?
Yes.
What are your hopes for that term, if you succeed?
You know, I believe very strongly that the work that we're doing today has been extremely difficult, and perhaps work that we should have been doing a long time ago. You know, restoring an economic foundation to ensure that every family in San Antonio can thrive and has opportunity in this city. That's not easy work. Housing affordability is not easy work. Putting public transportation down in a city that really had no bona fide mass transit system is not easy work. The stuff that we're doing is long term. And I feel very strongly that if we do our jobs right, my colleagues included, we're not going to be able to look on the scoreboard in 2 years or at the end of the term or in 5 years, frankly, and say, we won, success. So my focus has been, I got into this job because I wanted to make this city a place that my son would fall in love with, and his peers would too. And that's not going to end in my term. And in fact, it's not going to end, God willing, I leave office in 2025. So my focus has been, I'm going to do as good a job as I can, carry this ball as far down the field as I possibly can in the time that I'm given. And then hopefully, when my son is my age, we can look back and say, you know what, he made a difference. There's a quote that I always go back to from an old rabbi that Martin Luther King Jr. Used, which is that the arc of the moral universe is long and it's bent towards justice. In my view, the responsibility of elected officials is to be benders of that arc, and that's what I want to do with my time.
Speaking of that arc, several of your predecessors, like Henry Cisneros and Julian Castro, have gone on to other positions. Do you have any aspirations for other public office after leaving the mayoralty?
When I was growing up, I wanted to be the beat writer for the Boston Red Sox. That's my dream job. I don't, and I intentionally try to keep blinders on. I do have faith. I love this job. I thrive on stress, and I enjoy what I do. And I think when I'm done in 2025 in this job, I'll probably be asking, well, what's next? I do have faith that God will reveal a path when the time is right, but I don't know what that is, and I'm staying focused on being a great mayor. And I figure whatever happens next will be predicated on me doing as good a job as I can here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor. Before we open the mics for questions from our in-person audience, thank you to the Texas Tribune members who have joined us virtually and in person today. Your support makes events like this one possible. If you're not a member yet and you value our events, join using the QR code on your program or at texastribune.org. And now there are two mics available, one on either aisle. We invite you to come over. I also want to just plug out, make one more announcement, please. I hope you'll join us at the Texas Tribune Festival, where we're coming together this fall in downtown Austin, September 22nd through the 24th, for more than 100 conversations like the one we just had on Texas cities, climate, housing, and so much more. Get tickets and learn more at tribfest.org. And now for some audience questions.
Hi, good afternoon, gentlemen. Just wondering what the city's plans are for the vagrant and homeless population around the city, in particular downtown with the encampments, if there's been any progress or updates with that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, absolutely, and homelessness is obviously a significant challenge for urban communities. It was before the pandemic. It's become an increasing challenge in the time since, and of course, with the housing market the way it is, it's becoming an even bigger problem. So the first part is starting with what's our orientation to the issue, and that is we can't treat homelessness as the cause of something. We have to treat it as the manifestation of issues that are very individual to the family or to the person on the street. And so we have been working with the South Alamo Regional Alliance for Homeless, which is a conglomeration of nonprofits, along with our homeless outreach coordinators, to make sure that we're meeting folks where they are, understanding their issues, and trying to get them into services, restitutional services, whether that's healing from domestic violence or from substance abuse or something. So that's number one. We've got to make sure that we're looking at it as a continuum of care. But then you need to deploy every tool in the toolbox, from the work that we're doing to ensure a healthy housing ecosystem to the direct homeless support services. We have a terrific organization, Haven for Hope, but that's not the only thing that we need to be focused on. We've got to work with our housing coordinators on producing more permanent supportive housing to get folks from in a housing first framework, getting folks into housing even if they don't have that rehabilitative services yet, but providing that service to them on site, basically just getting folks off the street. At the end of the day, and I've done our point in time count several times now, you go out and you talk to people, and unfortunately, there are some folks who just, because of distrust or other issues, are not ready to come into services, not ready to come into shelter. And that's where, it requires some persistence and it requires some compassion from all of us, including the nonprofits who will be out there, every week, making sure if anything's changed, what do they need? Are they ready to come in? We've got to do that. So I hope that answers your question. The tents that are under the overpasses and things, become political hot potatoes. But I will tell you this, the city of San Antonio is not going to go in and abate homeless encampments just because we don't like the sight of them. That's not what we do. We try to help folks compassionately, and we try to make sure that folks have an option to get into services. And I want to thank the San Antonio voters in particular this weekend, or 2 weekends ago, for supporting the first ever housing affordability bond, which included specific funds that are going to be combined with ARP funds that we've used for permanent supportive housing. I think that is the first and most important thing we need to be doing in terms of scaling up. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Tiffany Williams. I actually have 2 questions. Sorry to hog the mic. My first question is, I grew up here in San Antonio. I moved to New York for a while, and I've returned. One of the things that I've noticed in several of our residences is that in much more of the disadvantaged areas, we have less access, public access to sidewalks. And as we can see, this is leading to obesity in our adults, which leads to obesity in our children. Also because of the home affordability and the gentrification that has taken place, we're seeing sidewalks go up in those areas, but we're not seeing sidewalks go up in the less or disadvantaged areas. I think this is really important to our mental stability, especially at this time. So I'm wondering what San Antonio is doing to take the lead on creating more public access for people who don't have cars, who do have to use Via, fantastic. You've grown a lot. My second question is voting. When San Antonio, it's not a major election, such as a presidential election, even our Senate voting, it is a very low percentage. What can we do to show citizens that there is not a disconnect between them voting and our Congress, that we can show them more ways of marketing, to get out the vote here, that there can be people that look like you from this city that you can vote for and that you can be a part of. Thank you.
I want to stand up and applaud the last one for sure. Well, that was my work at the Annenberg Public Policy Center, is trying to figure out how to get more people engaged, to understand, that what is happening in their community, in their backyards, as a result of who's being voted into office. And if you choose to stand out, you're voting for somebody else. But that point in particular, I think there's some systemic ways in local elections that we can increase voter turnout. Frankly, how many elections have we had now in the last 2 months? I've always been a proponent of consolidation of elections. To me, it makes sense in a fall election because more people are here. They are attuned to it's time to go vote. Our springtime elections are usually, at best 15% lately, and that's doubling of what they were 10 years ago. So I think there's things that we can do to increase voter engagement, among others. You were asking first, though, about how do we ensure, I would call it equity within our communities for access to jobs, to home, et cetera, without needing a car. 100% agree. And I will start by saying that is what we're focused on with the equity framework. How do we put more resources into building sidewalks in areas that, frankly, have been without? And that is a process that takes some time, though, because we're living on 100+ years of redlining plus inequitable investments. And that's why I think it takes takes a sustained commitment to that approach, building sidewalks, ensuring public transportation access, making sure that we have the gumption to manage growth rather than just contributing to sprawl. We've got to do that in a focused way, and that's why I think to wrap up with your second question, the most important thing we need to be asking local candidates is where they stand on those issues. I'm not worried about the council I sit with today. I know where they are, and I know we're going to be pushing this issue of equity for the time that we're together. What I'm more concerned about is, will the next mayor, will the next council stay on that commitment? It's very hard because the first step in equity is having a seat at the table. Now we've invited folks to sit at the table and have a voice in their government, which they frankly have not had for a very long time on issues like transportation access and housing. It's happening now, and we're hearing the histories of this city. And there's frustration that now we're committed to it, but where's the action? Where's the change? And, you know, Rome wasn't built in a day. It's going to take generational commitment to equity for us to address these long-lasting issues, and that's my hope for voting, is that we will maintain that commitment as the faces change on the council, diocese, and on the court, in the court.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, how are you doing? So my question has to do with mental health. Obviously, we're living in a world today where that's a main issue, particularly opioids, schools, what just happened yesterday. So what can we do here in San Antonio to help others to gain access or resources to get mental health help, such as programs going into the schools at all grade levels, or even to the public, because I myself suffer from mental health, and it is extremely hard just with my insurance to get where I'm at today. I've come a long way from 20 years, and I can only imagine just someone else that doesn't even know about any resources to easily give up and, you know, decide to do what they do. But we need a change in mental health situation.
I agree 100%, and I would say that about public health infrastructure in general. We need to properly resource public health infrastructure, which we have not done for a generation. And that's not just here at the local level, it's at the state and federal level as well. So that's the first thing. Specifically to mental health, we are putting a significant more effort and resource into mental health at the city of San Antonio, but I think starts with ending the stigma. You're not alone by far. And so we need to make sure that we are understanding mental health as physical health, and that we are ensuring that people have the knowledge and access resources. And you know, we need to have a conversation in this country about collective trauma. What we've been through over the last 2.5 years has been unthinkable, but that's built on collective trauma of you know, decades worth of pain, and that has not healed properly, that we're seeing manifest in things like gun violence, that we need to address as well. And so if we can have conversations about collective trauma in our communities, that will be a first step to realizing the benefit of the resources that we're trying to put into the public health infrastructure.
So what about the schools specifically?
The schools are part of that infrastructure, and we have a mobile health clinic that we're working with here in the city of San Antonio to direct resources into public schools. But you know, you're absolutely right. The one area that we should be most concerned about is with our children. I mean, they are going to be building a lifetime worth of you know, experience on top of trauma that is left unaddressed if we don't focus on it.
Thank you.
There's a few more questions, but we're running tight on time, so please be succinct.
I think that's a great opening to what I'm going to bring to you. I'm actually a former foster youth. Well, I consider myself still a foster youth of the government. I'm actually from Brownsville, Texas, so I was trafficked up and around the United States to Utah, North Carolina, and stuff like that. And my experience in San Antonio in foster care was not great. I was kicked out my senior year of high school from Holmes High School just because I wasn't paying taxes towards the district, even though I was homeless. So that really impeded my ability to get a higher education, which is part of my rights as a foster kid. I enrolled into a self-paced program where I did get my diploma, and I did enroll into Palo Alto. But as a Palo Alto student, I have experienced discrimination within the PATH program, BCFES, and I've also experienced discrimination with BCFS, which are both state they're given grants by the state and the federal government to help foster kids transition into adulthood. And I feel like they've been lacking in advocacy and representation. There's not enough money allocated to this department. They don't have a subgroup for disabled foster kids who need accommodations. And that ties in with physical health and mental health as well. So you have citizens trying, and I just campaigned for Jessica Cisneros as well. And the two BIPOC community children that I've taken under my wing because the foster care system has left them behind are living in my house. And when I registered them to vote, and I took them to vote yesterday, they couldn't even vote. So there is a generation that is trying to step up to the plate and be the examples that we need because the previous generations haven't been doing their job. And quite frankly, like I own a mortgage. I know how trust funds work. For me to pay $3,300 a year in property taxes is ridiculous for a student to have to be paying that without even getting financial aid or ETV, educational training voucher programs that this city was supposed to pick up. They did pick it up, but they picked it up too late. And because of my age, I don't qualify. So that's pretty ageist. I don't get any help from this city. Yet I do everything to help the people in and around my community. So I would like you to have a conversation with the Palo Alto program and the PATH program that has been implemented.
With which programs?
The PATH program, it's been implemented by the BCFES organization. Erica Buford is the director. And it was like signed in with Ina Manijerez as well when it first started in 2019. So I don't feel as though you guys are trying to get disabled people into the workforce. You're not letting us come to the table. Because I've been here for 2 years trying to give you a plan, trying to give you not just like complaining, but also a solution. I'm a campaign manager too. Like I understand how this stuff works. I just don't understand why I can't get an education. How come I can't get an education? You're talking about vulnerable children? I'm the most vulnerable child of your population.
Thank you. Let's let the mayor answer.
Okay, what was the question?
What are you going to do? It's on top of the previous question. How are you going to put those infrastructures into our schools from elementary to college? And how come you guys aren't following ADA laws? Like, that's not okay. How do we make sure that we're holding those schools accountable?
Well, so as you're aware, the state controls the public schools in San Antonio, but what we can do is work with various nonprofits, and what we're doing right now, specific with mental health, is with our mobile mental health clinic, working with those nonprofits that are in the schools directly to provide services to young people, students who are in trauma.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but you're funneling public money into private sector businesses, which a lot of them are religious organizations that are exempt from licensing and regulation. So I don't agree with that.
All of the nonprofits that we work with are licensed and regulated nonprofits. So
not for foster kids.
If you'd like to have a conversation separately, I don't know if I'm completely understanding your question, but I'm happy to talk with you after that.
Talking about foster care demographic, and we're not allowed to get an education or be active in our city.
We're gonna take just one final question. I'm sorry, I have to balance.
I'm happy to talk with you after so I can better understand the issue.
Thank you. One more question, please.
Thank you. So my question is related to the recent opening of the Northwest Vista STEM building and with
Which building?
The Northwest Vista College STEM building. There was the ribbon cutting ceremony this morning, and then Northeast Lakeview College will also be opening their STEM building next fall. So I was just interested because they were talking about breaking that cycle of generational poverty and how STEM jobs really provide that more income for those families. So I wanted to hear more about the different programs and partnerships that y'all had, whether it's STEM or just in general, with education in the community.
Well, thank you for that, and I'm glad that we're here in San Antonio College because the most significant area where we have intervened with our educational community, higher education, post-secondary education, is with our San Antonio community colleges, the Alamo Community College District, which is the best community college district in the country. Right before the pandemic, we launched the Alamo Promise program, which is a program that provides free community college tuition for virtually any Bexar County public high school graduate. The strength of that program is not just alignment to those STEM careers and other careers that are in demand, but it's also the fact that they are being surrounded by a constellation of nonprofits and community organizations that are devoted to reducing barriers and anticipating obstacles that someone might have in the course of their education to stay in school. So the focus of Alamo Promise is, in fact, making sure that folks have access to good quality jobs at the end of the day, that they get on, that they get out of a cycle of generational poverty, which a significant portion of our community is in. So, and since Alamo Promise was launched, we have started the workforce development program, Ready to Work, which comes on the heels of Train for Jobs. We're working with Alamo College's District Restore Education Project, Quest, and others to do the exact same thing for adult workforce. So, you know, one of the things I think we're going to be continually going back to is the fact that this community is beginning to align itself around this issue of economic mobility and paths to good quality jobs for the future for themselves and for their kids. So in Northwest Vista, San Antonio College, all of the college campuses at Alamo Colleges, to me, are the best examples we've got at this point.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, thank you so much for taking my questions. Thank you so much for taking questions from some of your constituents, audience members here at San Antonio College. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Sewell. Appreciate it.